Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we are here for my 2023 World Finals preview video. I'm very excited for this. This is really the last video that we have before we cover the last series of the year here on this channel, and after we've covered everything up until this point, this is kind of the culmination of everything that we have done across 2023, so I'm very, very excited for it. We're going to be going over pretty much every facet of this matchup here today, lane by lane, overall stuff, draft, potential matchups, things like that. Very, very interesting stuff. There's going to be a lot to talk about. There's definitely some interesting storylines going into this that are very fun to bring up, but if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Who do you think is going to win this series? Of course, I will be giving my opinion at the end of this video. I'll be talking about why I think, I have one team favorite over the other, and it might not be a huge surprise to those of you who watch my channel, but still, stick around, try to find out where I see the advantages and the disadvantages for each of these teams, because I really do think that matchup-wise, it's pretty intriguing. I think all four options were pretty intriguing storyline-wise. These two teams probably have the least in common in terms of facing off against each other, but they have some of the most interesting, storyline dynamics just individually amongst their players, and so I'm very excited for it. But again, let me know who you think is going to win, and if you agree or disagree with some of my takes down in the comment section below. But in today's video, we're going to be going lane by lane, kind of talking about what I think we could expect to see, not only in terms of gameplay style, but in draft style, just where I think a lot of these players and teams are going to go in terms of their, game plan moving into the finals, because I do think that there are a lot of different options for these teams. We've seen the meta really evolve over the course of this tournament. Basically, the group stage, the Swiss stage meta, I should say, is dead. There is no overlap from what we were seeing in the Swiss stage to what we are seeing now in the bracket stage, which is crazy. I don't think there's ever been a world championship before where the meta has adapted so much as the tournament has gone along. It certainly made things volatile and interesting, but basically everybody's trying to copy T1 now, and that certainly makes for a more interesting dynamic in terms of how these games play out early. It really puts a lot more emphasis on the first 10 minutes of the game, which we will talk about. But of course, going lane by lane means we get to start off with the top lane matchup, and our top lane matchup is one of the most interesting ones in this matchup in general, in the finals this year. It's the Shy for Weibo Gaming taking on Zeus from T1. Two of the biggest overperformers at this tournament up until this point. Not that either doesn't have the pedigree to warrant performances that they've been able to put out so far, but really these have been two of the best players at Worlds, and I certainly didn't expect that to be the case going into this tournament. Now, that's not as true for Zeus as it is for the Shy. Zeus was actually really good in the playoffs domestically in the LCK. Of course, we've covered the LPL and the LCK all year on this channel, every single game of both of those regions, and so, I have a pretty good idea of how these two have been able to develop over the course of 2023, and Zeus was phenomenal down the stretch for T1. He was the best player on that team in the LCK playoffs. He was the reason they ended up making finals in the LCK, and so I certainly don't want to sit here and say that his performances here at Worlds have been surprising or shocking in any regard, because he is a great player, and last year we were talking about him as easily one of the top two top laners in the world alongside 369. And so to see him kind of regain that title here, I think is really important. But more importantly, I think this narrative that had kind of been created surrounding Zeus, that he is a choker, that he's not a big game performer, I think that's something that he has thoroughly obliterated at this year's World Championships. Even in the playoffs in the LCK, he was phenomenal. He's the reason this team was able to auto-qualify. Not the only reason, but probably the biggest reason for Worlds without having to go through that regional qualifier system, being able to beat KT Rolster twice. But even outside of that, at Worlds, he's been a top 3 player at this tournament. If you want to make the argument that Zeus doesn't show up internationally, I just think that that's dead. I really don't think that you can make that argument anymore. Now, a big kind of narrative surrounding that part of Zeus's career has been his ability to play in the finals, which hasn't necessarily stepped up. We've seen him, kind of get beaten down by Doran in the finals in the LCK over the course of this year, and last year, obviously, everything that happened with Kingen against DRX, this is his moment to kind of prove that, no, the finals curse is not necessarily real. He's just not gotten a little unlucky. He's played some really good top laners, and it hasn't necessarily worked out for him, but going up against another really talented top laner, this is his chance, I think, to really prove that that narrative was never right to begin with. And then, he is facing the Shy, which is certainly a difficult matchup, in and of itself. It's certainly not going to be easy to take down the Shy because of the way he has been playing at Worlds. Now, his kind of resurgence at this tournament, I think, has been a little bit more surprising, at least for me, because of just what he has been in the LPL. Not only this year, but over the past, 3 or so years, maybe even longer than that, 3 or 4 years, he's really not been all that good in the LPL. Not even just, a mediocre top laner. He's been, a below-average top laner in the LPL, but we know that we can attribute at least some of that to effort, and, whether you want to criticize that or not, we know that, the Shy has been criticized in the past for not necessarily taking solo queue very seriously, for, being a little bit more laissez-faire, if you will, when it comes to the LPL regular season games, but, it's really good to see him get back onto the international stage and kind of reactivate the part of the Shy that made him one of the most interesting top laners of all time back in 2018, and so really happy to see this matchup, but you can see the champion diversity between these two players is kind of small. Both of them have very much favored the Aatrox over the course of this tournament. Aatrox has really emerged as the #1 top laner at Worlds this year. Very similar to 2022, if we're being entirely honest. Remember, last year's World Finals was very much dictated by the Aatrox. Kingen was phenomenal on that champion. He earned Finals MVP for his really good performances on that Aatrox, and I could really see a world in which it does end up being relatively similar here if either Zeus or the Shy can really take over some of these matchups if one of them gets Aatrox a little bit more consistently, considering both of them have prioritized that champion so heavily. I could see that being a major advantage. Now, the Rumble is also going to be a big pick, although I think Rumble is a little bit overrated. As I've stated throughout this tournament up until this point, I think Rumble as a pick is strong. I don't think it's permaban worthy, as we've kind of seen it at this tournament, but, Rumble can still have a pretty good effect. Worth noting, though, that Aatrox is actually a very good matchup into Rumble early. It's something that I wouldn't necessarily expect to see if Aatrox is still left up on the board. We could see some Aatrox bans coming out from these two teams. I would be relatively surprised about that. Would be a little bit more common maybe in the second rotation of bans, because I don't think Aatrox is worth a top 3 ban. I don't think anybody in the top lane right now is worth a top 3 ban, maybe with the exception of Cassante if you really just don't want to deal with that, which I do understand, but I would expect both of these players to kind of be able to get what they want. Red side's going to be kind of important for both of them because I think counterpick is probably going to go to top lane in a lot of circumstances. The only other lane that I think really values counterpick in this matchup is support. I don't think jungle, mid, or AD carry are going to be trying to wait in the draft for counterpick. I think they're going to be picking the strongest picks. And so, if support wants to go for something that maybe is going to be a little bit highly prioritized, maybe we see some of those marksmen be a little bit higher prioritized as we've seen throughout this tournament up until this point. Things like the Ashe, even things like the Caitlyn, right, being pulled out early on in draft phases, or even things like Renata, right, or Lulu, things of that vein that want to be able to pressure early. If we're seeing that out of the support position on R2 or B2 or something like that, then I would expect R5 almost every draft to go to top lane, and I think that could be a pretty important kind of distinction. It's really the lane that matters the most when it comes to red side versus blue side. I think the blue side obviously is very strong because there's a lot of really OP picks in the meta right now, but for top lane in particular, I think that's really the lane that benefits the most from red side. But we can see the Shy. We know he plays tanks now. That's kind of been a development that he's made over the course of the last couple of years, as he's been more willing to play things like Cassante and Ornn, and I do think that will help this team. They do like to put pressure in other areas as well, and we know the Shy is willing to give up some of his resources in order to make the team look a little bit better. But if I had to put a favorite in this matchup, I guess, if I had to kind of balance this out, I would say that Zeus is definitely someone I would expect to perform at least a little bit better, if only because he's done it over a larger period of time. However, if we're just going off of the form at this tournament, I think both of them have been relatively equal. I know the Shy fans aren't going to want to hear that. I see a lot of people saying that he has been by far the best player at this tournament. I have him, tied for 2 right now with Zeus. I think, Faker has been phenomenal, and we will get to that, and the Shy and Zeus are right there at 2 and 3 in whatever order you want to put them in. I think this is closer to a 50-50 than a lot of people are going to say it is. I think Zeus is a very good player, and, the Shy has also been very good at this tournament. I expect both of them to show up in the World Finals, and I think, generally speaking, out of all the matchups in this, World Finals between these two teams, I think this is probably the one that is going to be the most interesting. But then moving on from our top lane matchup to our jungle matchup, and this one is pretty intriguing. I think this is, in my opinion, maybe the most lopsided of all of the matchups in this series, but we'll go ahead and describe that. Of course, it's Weibo Gaming's Weiwei taking on T1's Owner, and I think a lot of the reason that I think that this is T1 favored, as you can see from the percentile graph. By the way, I never even introduced that at the beginning of the video. You can see at the bottom, Weiwei is in white background and Owner is in black background, and you're going to see that amount to change over the course of this video. The more that is in the direction of one team or the other, the higher I think that is in favor of them. So as you can see here, I think this is a pretty in favor of T1 matchup because I do think Owner should be the better player going into this series. But let's go ahead and talk about why, starting with Owner, because he has been phenomenal at this tournament. There really is no other way to say it. He has also been one of the top 5 best players at Worlds this year. It really feels like he has re-emerged and refound himself and his confidence, which was the most important thing for him over the course of this year. He was spectacular in Spring. He was arguably the best jungler in the world in the Spring Split when T1 was just clicking on all cylinders, when everybody on that team deserved to be considered some of the best players in their role in the world, if not the best player in their role in the world. Owner was definitely in that conversation, but Faker had to take some time off for some injuries in the Summer Split. And the person who felt that the hardest was Owner. He was really bad over the second half of the Summer Split. It wasn't just like, oh, he's not playing up to his standard. He was genuinely bad for that team. He was one of the worst junglers in the LCK. He was not able to perform really even at a competent level, was getting outpaced by basically everybody that he was playing into, even just like average LCK junglers, which is never a good sign. And it was going to be a concern for him going into this tournament. Even when Faker did come back in the playoffs domestically in the LCK, Owner still was probably the weak link of this team. He was the one who was taking the longest to kind of get back on track, to get his mojo back, but whatever happened in between the end of the LCK playoffs and the beginning of Worlds clearly helped get his mental back on track, because he has been spectacular at this tournament. He's done it in a way that has really been able to help the rest of his laners and the rest of his team be the best that they can possibly be. He's not picking these hyper carries. He's not trying to gain resources in the jungle position like he was in 2022. It's a much different style. It's less Viego, and it's more Rel and Poppy and Jarvan and things of that nature, which I think is super important for how this team likes to play the game. What Owner has really been fantastic at is keeping games alive for T1 over the course of this tournament. It's actually been, kind of staggering how many early games T1 has struggled with, considering how strong I think the meta is in favor of early game right now. But T1 does such a good job being able to slow the pace of the game down and really kind of taking away a lot of the resources that the enemy wants to play for. And Owner, I think, is the biggest part of that. That's why I think he is favored in this matchup, because his early games, when they go off, when they work, they're dominant. They have been his entire career. But now, even if his early game isn't perfect, he is phenomenal in the mid game, really good enough to be able to keep his team alive even in bad circumstances. Go watch Game 3 from the semifinals. It is the best example of what I'm talking about. That Rel game was truly spectacular. But Weibo on the other side has honestly been, alright over the course of this tournament. He has overperformed my expectations. I did not have a lot of expectations for him coming into this tournament. I thought he was just a fine jungler. And honestly, I'm really still not all that out on that opinion. I still think Weibo is probably the weakest link, quote unquote, of Weibo at the current moment. The player that I have the least confidence is going to be able to step up and have a major performance here in the finals, and he's unfortunately one of the ones that is going to need to do that at the highest level, because again, Owner really does need to lose his early game, or else it's very difficult to end up taking on this T1 team. They do so well with macro advantages when they have control, when they have tempo over the map, that the enemy jungler really needs to step up and be a pivotal piece in order for you to be able to beat this T1 team. We saw what happened when jungle was in favor of T1 against JD Gaming. Obviously against LNG as well, but specifically against Gen.G, where they were just able to run a lot of the game and basically neutralize a lot of the mechanical differences that maybe some of the other lanes had. I think Weibo is going to need to step up in order to do that, and while I think Weibo has had some good games over this tournament, I think he's also had some bad ones, and this is a really tough matchup for him. Now, I said that about, both of the matchups that he's had in the bracket stage up until this point. I thought Contracts was going to be an interesting matchup. It turned out to not be. Weibo was significantly better, but that's not entirely surprising. He should have been going into this tournament, but the one that really shocked me was just Weibo being better than Xun. Now, Xun was really bad in that series. It's really hard to know whether or not that was him underperforming or Weibo overperforming, but you do have to give him credit for how well he played and the impact that he was able to have in the semifinals here. If he's going to be able to have a similar impact, if this is closer to a 50-50 than it is to just being like a 70-30 in favor of T1, I do think that's going to be the biggest swing point in this series, to be able to keep Weibo Gaming in the driver's seat. Weibo is going to be incredibly important now. If he's going to continuously pull out some of these slower picks, things like the Poppy and the Maokai. Now, Poppy can have, pressure early. I guess Maokai can have pressure early, but these are definitely more for the team fight stage of the game than they are for, like, the first 5 to 8 minutes of the game. I am going to be a little bit concerned. I don't think that's the draft strategy I personally would go for against T1. You want to be playing things like the Rel at a super high level because you do need to establish that pressure early. Hell, I would want things like Jarvan, hell, even a Vi in this matchup, I think could be relatively interesting just to give yourself something that you can play through fast and quickly, but making sure that you have the opportunity to get your laners ahead, which is something Weibo does at a very high level, that's going to be the most important thing. As long as the tempo doesn't get too out of control, as long as T1 doesn't really get to control how Weibo plays the game, then I think it should be fine. That's going to be Weibo's goal, but I think generally in this matchup, if you're going off of the performances we've seen at this tournament, Owner should be favored, and I would say that he's probably the more talented jungler as well. And now we get to the Legacy lane, the one that I'm very excited to talk about because I do think that there are some interesting conversations to have around this matchup. It's the mid lane matchup, and I really do think that there are opportunities for both of these teams to do something interesting here in the mid lane. I love what Faker has been able to do over the course of this tournament, but I really love how Weibo has drafted around the mid lane over the course of this tournament. I think they've arguably been the single best drafting team in terms of actually being able to capitalize and take advantage of some of the weaknesses of some of the quote-unquote really strong mid laners in the game right now. And so I do think that there is more room for discussion here than I think a lot of people would anticipate, but I do still think it is favored in one side purely because of just some of the performances that we've seen, and that side is T1, and it is Faker, because honestly, I don't know if it's a hot take to say this. I haven't, necessarily seen this over the course of, like, a lot of big analysts, but I think Faker has been the best player at Worlds. I think in terms of the performances that he has been putting out, I think he has been the #1 player at this tournament, and that's crazy because he won his first World Championship 10 years ago, a decade ago, and yet he is still sitting here performing at a level that is maybe near the top of his career. Like, we have not seen Faker as good as he was in 2023 since, like, 2016, 2017, like, that era of SKT. That's the last time Faker has really been playing at the level that he was at this year, because it's really not just this tournament that he's been super good at. He was great all year long. He was second in MVP voting for me in the spring split for the LCK. Now, obviously, he took a ton of time off in the summer, but honestly, that just opened up a lot of people's eyes to how important he was for what this team does, not only from a macro sense, but in terms of being able to generate pressure out of the mid lane, to allow his jungler to play a lot more aggressive, to allow his support to be able to play a lot more aggressive. His ability to win 1v1 was very important towards their game plan, and that was really shown when he left and when he came back, and just how much of a difference this team had in his ability to play there. Now, I don't want to overstate, what Faker is able to do and undervalue what the rest of this team is able to do, because I think, honestly, the conversation surrounding some of the players on this team has gotten a little bit out of control. I don't think Faker is just mind controlling all of them to be good. I just think playstyle-wise, Faker is perfect for enabling and allowing the rest of his teammates to play at their best level, to let them just kind of be the solo queue superstars that they can be, to play whatever they feel comfortable playing and to be able to dominate 1v1 or 2v2 and to take a lot of the macro pressure off of them. I think Faker really allows that more than other mid laners, and that's why I do think he's super valuable, but mechanically speaking, he has been spectacular, sensational, whatever word you want to use here. He has just been perfect over the course of this tournament. Whether it's on Ori, whether it's on Azir, mostly on those two champions, he's been really, really good. Now, if there is a flaw, it's what I brought up just there. It's that Faker's champion pool over the course of this tournament has been relatively small. He has very much favored the Orianna and has very much answered with the Azir in basically every other circumstance. There really aren't a lot of other things that he's willing to go to. We see the Sylas up on the board here, but Sylas has really been like a distant third option for Faker over the course of this tournament, which really opens up the idea for potentially being able to ban out Faker a little bit more. I don't necessarily think Faker's champion pool is small. I just think he thinks these two champions are significantly better than the rest in the current meta. And weirdly enough, I think that might actually favor Xiaohu. This is something I've complained about for mid laners over the course of this tournament, but this idea that Azir and Orianna are the two, like, pinnacle mid laners in the game right now, I do think they're the strongest and most consistent, but they're certainly not unanswerable, and they certainly have opportunities to be able to get countered. And I think Xiaohu's champion pool is really kind of set up to do that. He's done a really good job over the course of this tournament, actually capitalizing on that. I think Nico is the strongest mid laner in the game right now. I know a lot of people are just going to say Ori because of just how efficiently she scales, just how, no-brainer it is in team fights to be as strong as she is, but her early game is weak, and Nico's early game is strong, and to be able to generate that pressure consistently on the side of the Nico, it's been something that has been very valuable to teams over the course of this tournament, even going back into, like, the play-in stage. We've seen that really be a big asset for teams, and Syndra is probably the most simple answer to both Azir and Orianna. She's kind of known as a counter pick specifically to Ori, and, you know, Xiaohu has certainly been willing to pull that out. That hasn't necessarily looked as good in recent games, but it hasn't necessarily been the Syndra's fault. Typically speaking, in the 1v1, Syndra is winning. It's just the rest of the map that ends up going poorly because red side isn't very strong right now, but I think there are ways to counter Orianna and Azir, and so if you're looking at something that is maybe a negative for Faker, it is kind of the lack of diversity that he's shown at this tournament, but again, it's Faker. I'm not worried about his champion pool. We know he can play everything in the game. We know he's got a very high, you know, adaptability rating, if you will, and I'm just really not all that worried about it. But if he is stuck on B1 Orianna or B1 Azir every single game, if they're going to give it to him, then things like the Nico, things like the Syndra could actually put Weibo in a relatively decent spot if they're willing to play around it like they have been over the course of this tournament. That's going to be Faker's weakness, and that's going to be Xiaohu's major strength here, is I think his ability to play a lot of these quote-unquote counter picks. He doesn't necessarily need to be given a ton of priority in draft. He likes these individual 1v1 matchups. He has over the course of his entire career. One of the things that has kind of plagued Xiaohu is this mentality and idea that he is this selfish player, and, you know, he's somebody that needs a lot of resources in order to be good. He got a lot of that when he was on RNG over the course of his career, and I think that does come out in the idea that, oh, he wants counter pick in the mid lane matchup. He wants something that he can win on, and, you know, he doesn't want to pick Ori or, you know, even Azir early in drafts, although he will pick the Azir, right? He doesn't want to pick Ori super early in drafts, but I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think Xiaohu just wants to put his team in a really good spot. Xiaohu does need a few more resources in order to get ahead than maybe some other mid laners that you might know. But I've always compared him to a player like Rookie. I think they actually have very similar playstyles, and Rookie never really gets that same kind of complaint. And so for Xiaohu, I would expect him to be just fine. Now, the concern with Xiaohu has been his individual lane performances across this tournament up until this point. He's had some mechanical misplays. I'm really not going to lie to you. There's been some matchups that he hasn't looked quite as good in. He looked very good against Yagao, although Yagao was easily the best performing member of Bilibili in that series. And honestly, if you were going to point out something that was a little bit questionable, it was the early laning phase in those circumstances, allowing Yagao to stay alive. In the semifinals, he was able to clap Palafox both times that they played, both in the quarterfinals and then obviously on day one. But basically every other game that this team has played across this tournament so far, Xiaohu has just kind of been fine. And that's certainly something to keep in mind. I'm very excited about the storyline of Xiaohu finally getting here, finally getting to a World Finals. The narrative that he is just a spring warrior and that obviously he destroys MSI, a 3-time MSI winner, but is never able to get it done at Worlds has always, you know, irked me. I think narratives like that are things that I really established this channel to kind of push back on in the first place. I think often narratives like that take a lot of the context away, make situations black and white. And it's good to see that Xiaohu, when you surround him with talent that can perform well, can still do well, and, you know, actually is a big asset to a team that wants to make World Finals, and he has the opportunity to take down the GOAT here and win his first ever World Finals to cement himself as one of the greatest mid laners of all time. But, you know, it's just going to be a little bit of a difficult challenge. I think if he picks a lot of the Nico, a lot of the Syndra, I actually have a lot more confidence in him in that series if that's going to be the direction that he wants to go. If he ends up defaulting to more of the Azir, Orianna, and just trying to match Faker in terms of the picks that Faker is really good at, I think that's where some of the problems could come in, and that's why I'm going to start favoring Faker, because I do think that is actually a pretty, you know, easy possibility in a series like this. But I do think this could be a lot closer than what I'm saying here, than the 70-30, even like the 80-20 that I could consider this being. I think Xiaohu has the opportunity to go toe-to-toe with Faker, but with the way Faker has been playing over the course of the last few weeks, and really over the course of 2023, I just don't know if there's any mid laner in the world right now that's consistently going to be able to shut him down. And then moving on to our bot lane matchup. We're going to start with the AD carries. We're going to get to the supports in just a second, but this is really where the meta of this tournament has kind of changed so much. Obviously, T1 has been notorious for bringing out a lot of these crazy support picks, these crazy bot lane duos all year long. It's really what gained them a lot of notoriety and really what made them different in spring. What made them, in my opinion, the best team in the world in spring until we realized how good JD Gaming truly was just how crazy T1 was able to dominate on some of these more out there bot lane combinations. Things like the Kalista plus the Ashe. Things like Varus Ashe, obviously, as well. Even like the Caitlyn Kalista duo lanes. Just some very, very weird things that they were able to pull out that, you know, other teams just didn't have any sort of real answers to. And they've been really going back to that over the course of this tournament. But the difference now is that teams are kind of ready for it. I don't know what's been going on in scrims. Obviously, I'm not privy to what's been happening to T1 and against T1 and for T1 in a lot of these scrims. But teams are very much ready to play against these combos on stage now because they themselves are pulling it out. And it's not even just against T1. Look at the Weibo Gaming versus Bilibili semifinal series. both teams were willing to pull out these, marksman supports and even some of these enchanters that just kind of try and shut it down. And basically every team in the world has adapted to that, which is crazy. There's no more Engagers, there's no more Rakan, no more Alistair, no more Nautilus. These champions that we saw so commonly, the most picked supports throughout basically the entirety of the Swiss stage, are just gone. They're not in the meta anymore. And again, I think you have T1 mostly to thank for that. I don't know what's been going on in scrims, but I would expect that to continue here in World Finals. Now, do I think that that's optimal? Honestly, no. I really think that we've over-adjusted. I think these teams are desperately looking for avenues in which to stop what T1 is doing, but I think Engagers can still be relevant. I know they don't necessarily have the same kind of strength in the early, level 1 to level 3. Melee supports are just never going to be able to contest what a marksman in the support position is going to be able to do, but I think there are compromises to that. There have been champions that have been pulled out in the recent weeks that have been very, very strong into these picks that I think have been a little bit more active. Things like the Bard, things like the Renata, even something like a Lulu I think could be relatively good. These are answers, and that's why it's going to be interesting, but we're not at the support position just yet. I kind of got carried away there a little bit, but let's talk about the marksman first and foremost. As you can see from basically both of these players' champion pools, we've very much adjusted to the early game marksman style, things like the Xayah, things like the Kalista, things like the Caitlyn, the Varus, things that want to win early are definitely going to be the most common amongst these bot laners. Now, that's not the only thing that they can play. We know scaling is definitely still in play, and those hyper carry bot laners that, again, were kind of taking over the tournament for a majority of the play-in and the Swiss stage, they're still viable. Things like the Aphelios, things like the Kaisa, even the Xayah, right, falls into that camp, I still think are, potentially on the table for things that are going to be played, but I would expect both of these teams to prioritize these lane-dominant, lane-oriented picks. Again, things like the Kalista, the Varus, the Caitlyn, those are the champions. Even the Ashe, potentially as an AD carry, we could be seeing in this matchup. Now, player-wise, I think this is very even. I know that people don't necessarily want to hear that, but I think both of these players have pretty similar playstyles. I think a lot of people are going to favor Gumayushi pretty heavily in this matchup, and while I do think he's the better player, I don't think it's by, a ginormous amount. I think Light has more than shown that he can hold his own, especially when the rest of his team is doing well. Light has been phenomenal at Worlds this year. He's not gotten the credit that he's deserved, but that's kind of been the case for him over the course of his entire career, back to his days on LNG. He's never really been the guy that's gotten the credit for the gameplay that he's been able to put out at the AD carry position, and hopefully I can convince some people that Light is actually more than willing to hold his own in this matchup and could be a major asset. But let's talk about Guma first, because we always start with T1, apparently, as we've done through the first 3 positions, but Guma is basically the inventor of this, because he's the AD carry that was first willing to take a back seat to his support. And that's really kind of the conversation surrounding Guma, not only at this tournament, but I guess throughout this year up until this point, is that Guma individually has not necessarily stood out the same as some of the other, top AD carries in the world. Even a player like Pays in his own region, or a player like Ruler, right? He's not necessarily at the same kind of performances as those players in 2023, but a lot of that is what the team has asked him to do. And what they've asked him to do is essentially be a support for this team, while Keria ends up being this main facilitator, this primary playmaker, and pseudo carry for T1. And Guma, I think, has adapted to that better than basically any other AD carry could in the entire world. I value Guma very highly. I got a lot of pushback for how highly I value Guma over the course of this year, but I think the only thing that he has proven is that whatever you ask him to do, he can do at a high level. In summer, he was a bit of a carry for this team. When things were kind of falling apart, when Faker was gone, Guma was stepping up and was winning games in the bot lane, was winning 2v2s in more standard lanes, and was looking phenomenal doing so. We know that he can still do that. That's why the Xayah is still going to be a very big threat against Weibo Gaming in this series, is because if you give someone like Guma Xayah, he's going to outplay your carry and he's going to dominate. That's what he did to Ruler in the JDG matchup. He was phenomenal macro-wise and mechanic-wise in the semifinals, and if he's going to be able to perform like that, he is going to be the better AD carry. It's just going to be about what he's asked to do. If he's asked to be more of a carry, then I think he can do it. But if he's asked to play Varus and Kalista with an Ashe as the support, and, for him to be a little bit more of passive in the early laning phase, or maybe be a little bit more of that just lane dominant pick, allowing his mid jungle to take a little bit more of the spotlight, he can do that at a super high level as well. And so, again, Guma's just a very versatile player, but You could say the same thing about Light. I don't think he's necessarily as versatile in terms of the champions or the things that he's going to be playing, but he's the most consistent AD carry in the world, and it really has kind of shown itself at this tournament. If his team is in a good position, the only thing that he is going to do is further that good position. He's going to look really, really good when the rest of his team is playing really well, and he himself is mechanically talented enough to be able to go up against any AD carry in the world. Now, is he the same kind of aggressive playmaker that some of the other AD carries are? No. We saw that against Elk. Elk was going out there trying to make plays, looking like, you know, this big superstar, and, you know, some of those plays worked and some of those plays didn't, and that's kind of really what separated Light in that series. Is Elk was trying to do a little bit too much, and that's never going to be something that Light ends up falling into the trap of. He's never going to try to do too much. Could you ask him potentially to do a little bit more in certain circumstances? Potentially, but his late game team fighting is phenomenal, and honestly, I think that, you know, Weibo would benefit from going back to some more traditional bot lanes. I think that, you know, their bot lane in general definitely functions a little bit at a higher level when they're playing more traditional bot lanes. We saw how, you know, up and down the supports were when they were playing Ashe in that series, and I think that, you know, a player like Light definitely benefits a lot from being able to scale into the late game and being able to team fight. He's essentially the insurance policy for Weibo. When the Shy is dominating in the top lane and you've got, you know, Xiaohu and Wei Wei trying to make their waves in the mid jungle, Light is always going to be online in the late game. You really don't have to worry about that all that much, which I do think is a major advantage for Weibo. Do I think he's as talented as Guma? No, but kind of yes. Like, this is really closer to a 50-50 than people give it credit for. I think both of these teams are going to prioritize those more aggressive early game bot lanes. Like I said, the Varus, the Kalista, the Caitlyn, you know, things like that I think are definitely going to be prioritized. But if Aphelios, Kai'Sa, Xayah, if these things continue to be picked up and be shown, I expect it to be more on the side of Weibo because of how Light plays. I think this is going to be a fun bot lane matchup, but at the end of the day, the reason I think this is so even is because I think bot lane in general right now is much more determined by the support than it is by the AD carry, and so as much as I like these two players, it's probably going to be about their partners a tad bit more over the course of the series. And that brings us to our final lane-by-lane matchup, I guess, or position-by-position matchup here as we talk about the supports. And like I said, in the previous bot lane matchup, I think supports are crazy important in the current meta. I think it's jungle, I think it's mid, and I think it's support that really matter. Obviously, top and bot can really affect the game, as we've seen from what these top laners have been able to do, and even a player like Light, what he's been able to do over the course of this tournament, but I really do think supports are really where things start to get very interesting and where a series could really start to change in favor of one team or the other. And I think this support matchup is very interesting to look at because I think this is a form versus, you know, year-end kind of debate because I think one player has been significantly better at this tournament and I think the other was significantly better over the course of the 2023 season, really the summer split in particular. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. The player that's more in form for me is obviously Keria, who I think has been really good at this tournament. T1 in general has been really, really solid. Destroying LNG, you know, beating up on JD Gaming, Keria was a big part of that, and being able to pull out some of these more, I guess, aggressive support picks, you know, things like the Bard that really came into effect in the previous series, I think really did change kind of the outcome of how a lot of the other teams are going to look at them for the rest of this series, but, you know, obviously we know we can pull out the Ashe, we know we can pull out the Caitlyn, we know we can pull out the Varus, you know, these things are going to be on the table for him as a support pick, but, you know, even something like the Senna, we saw them flex that into the support role, you know, he can pick up the Tahm Kench as well if they want to go ahead and play that. There are options for what Keria wants to do, and that's exactly what makes him the most dangerous support in the world. He was the MVP of the Spring Split in the LCK for a reason. We were talking about him as the best player in the world at the end of the Spring Split for a reason, and it's because nobody really changes and affects game plans quite like Keria does. There just really haven't been supports over the course of League of Legends history that have been able to completely change and alter the meta based on their playstyle in the way that Keria has been able to do it here in 2023. We've seen teams copying what he wants to do now, but he's very expansive. He's going to keep his, you know, playstyle and his ideas, you know, unique, and he's going to change them up to try and capitalize on what, you know, Weibo Gaming wants to do. We talked about top laners potentially wanting to get counterpick on R5 in this series, that potentially being a pretty big variable. Support is really the other matchup that I think could definitely be this big counterpick city kind of role in this series, and especially when T1 is on red side, I think that that could very much be an avenue. That's something that they wanted to capitalize on over the course of this tournament just in general, is being able to get that counter pick for Keria, being able to make sure that whatever 2v2 they're playing in the bot lane is advantageous early on, because what Keria likes to do is play fast, and, you know, if he's going to be able to move around the map in the mid game because he has this gigantic lead, then the game's basically over. That's a position that T1 knows how to play really, really well, and they know how to play games out from that position incredibly well. They're going to be able to beat you from that spot. Really, where T1 has run into some problems is when the bot lane does doesn't win nearly as hard as maybe you would want them to in a particular matchup. And so certainly something to keep an eye on, but Keria is ridiculously talented, and he's going to be one of the big reasons why this matchup is so variable for both of these teams. But Crisp, you know, he's going to have a reputation for what he's been able to do at this tournament, which honestly really hasn't been all that phenomenal, or at least it hasn't been consistent. It certainly has not been the same as his bot lane partner in Light. But when you go back and look at his LPL year, he was awesome in the LPL across 2023. In my opinion, going into this tournament, he was the best player for Weibo. You know, in the regular season, in the playoffs, for what this team was able to do, for how they were able to generate their leads, Crisp was the most important player for how they played the game. That has not necessarily translated to Worlds yet, which certainly is concerning because the meta has adapted a ton, and Crisp is definitely much more of an engager player than he is like an enchanter or a marksman type of player in the support position. It's not necessarily a meta that he, you know, excels on all that much. It's very similar to what I talked about when we were talking about Light, where Light's a very good player, and I feel good about Light, but, you know, would feel better about him if we were in the meta where he could play Kai'Sa, he could play Aphelios, and he could scale into the late game and not worry about too much in the early game. And I would say the same thing about Crisp. If he was allowed to play Leona and Nautilus every game, I would feel a little bit better, but, you know, he's still good at things like the Renata and the Milio, and specifically the Renata we saw be a really big asset for Weibo in their tournament bracket run up until this point. If Renata's going to be a major pick in this series, which I do believe it will be, I think it will be the most valuable support across both of these teams in this series, then I imagine that Crisp will be trying to get that on B1, R1, R2 very early on in the drafts, or at least that's what I would be willing to do if I'm Weibo Gaming. Now, if you lose out on that Renata and you don't want to go for something like the Milio, which we know Crisp can play, I honestly don't hate going back to engagers here. I don't hate going to the Nautilus. I don't hate going to the Rakan if they leave it up. That's something that I expect to be banned out for a majority of this series, if not the entire series, by T1. I could see that being an option, but Crisp we know is a major playmaker. He's somebody who loves to move around the map. He loves to create numbers advantages, and his macro game is incredibly strong. He is a very aggressive support, and he's willing to try and make plays, but his weakness is going to be isolated in the 2v2. If they do try and fight a little bit more often in just like the 2v2 in lane, if you're going to be playing a lot more of these engagers and just trying to fight early, then I don't necessarily think that plays to his strengths, as we've seen throughout this tournament. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's why Keria is favored in this matchup for me, because I think the meta does favor Keria significantly better, considering he was the one who kind of created it. But Crisp is a very talented player, and going into this tournament, I would have told you Crisp was the better player, and that's what I did in my primer. Crisp was playing better, and so I can see a world, an opportunity for Crisp to potentially, like, you know, maybe go back to these engagers that maybe T1 isn't quite as ready for and, you know, perform well. I just don't necessarily see that being the case. I think T1 is going to be ready for these engagers. I think if it is pulled out, they don't necessarily have a super favorable matchup into the things that Keria has been piloting, and that could be a concern. It's really going to be about who can play Keria's style better, and when Keria's in the matchup, that's definitely not good for Crisp. But, you know, his inconsistency has definitely given us some bad games, but it's given us some good games as well. If the good games can overpower some of the bad games that he's had over the course of this tournament, then I think Crisp is in for a pretty interesting, you know, series. But if Keria dominates, I think T1 is going to be able to control a lot of the pacing and the tempo in the series, and I think support is very important for that exact reason. So Keria getting kind of the stamp of approval from me in this matchup, but again, I really like Crisp, and I can see a world in which this is more even than maybe I'm predicting it to be here. All right, but that is going to do it for my lane-by-lane analysis. It's time to talk about everything in terms of the grand picture. As much as we can sit here and say that, you know, one lane is going to beat another and you know, maybe 3 lanes win or 4 lanes win or whatever, right? Like, and that may mean that that team should be favored. That's not how you should analyze League of Legends, in my opinion. It really is about the sum of the parts rather than the parts themselves. So what does all of this mean? Well, you can probably get an idea for who I'm favoring in this series, and that is T1. I think they should be the better team in this series. I think they're more talented. I called T1 versus Gen.G the real world finals for a reason, because I do think that they were the 2 best teams in the world, and T1 being able to outclass JD Gaming, I think proves that T1 should be able to outclass Weibo. Now, Weibo has been playing better than they have played all year long at this tournament, and if there was ever a time for them to be able to upset T1, it's this. T1's finals curse is very much still active. You know, we very much have not seen T1 be able to overcome some of their demons in the past couple of years. And remember, last year they took down JD Gaming in the semifinals only to face a number 4 seed in the finals in DRX, and they weren't able to get over DRX. We saw the upset in 5. That very well could happen again. Players like the Shy and Light have been playing phenomenally for Weibo, and I think if the Shy and Light really do step up, and if they're the best players in this series, then Weibo very much can and probably will win a series in that vein. I really do think that they're that strong. The Shy has been that important towards what this team has done. I think, Light is obviously super important. If Xiaohu can step up and be the Xiaohu that we know, if Crisp has just the good games and not the bad games that he's had over the course of this tournament, like, there are avenues for Weibo to be able to win this, but I do think that meta is very much in favor of T1 right now, and that's why I'm going to favor them here. I think that a lot of the compounding factors that we've talked about have just led to T1 being a little bit more of a complete team right now. I think they're the best macro team in the world. I think they're the best drafting team in the world, as I've talked about multiple times on this channel over the course of this tournament. There's just no team that's been able to match what they've been able to do with tempo, and there's no team that's been able to match them in draft. They've consistently been able to get leads against teams like JD Gaming and LNG purely out of draft that other teams are just not able to do, even a team like Weibo. And so T1 just has all the tools right now. If they lose this, I do think it's more on them than it is on Weibo stepping up, but it's going to be a fun series either way. But I would love to know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me that this is T1 favored, or do you think Weibo can complete the upset and win Worlds? I would love to know your thoughts. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps this video a lot in the algorithm. It helps get it out to more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering the World Finals in depth, just like we've done every other game and every other series across this tournament so far. And then with offseason right around the corner, we already know so many players that are swapping teams, so many of the new configurations, especially in the West. We're going to be covering it all on this channel. And so if you're excited about that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all